I want to believe more than I want anything else in this world. But God is not letting me in. And I'm upset. I'm sad. I'm confused. I feel like maintaining faith in today's age is harder than going to the gym. Just have faith, they say. But how? How? What am I missing?
Maybe none of it was real.
Welcome back everyone to Bridge the Divide, where we examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're going to take a look at a video from the channel Exposing Atheism. And yes, I agree with you, that is kind of a weird name. Is the unnamed host here exposing atheism as actually being something that atheists don't realize it is? Is he exposing atheism to the evidence that shows it to be logically contradictory? Or is he exposing atheism by revenge posting those special pictures that atheism let him take back when they were together?
Why would he do that?
Whichever it happens to be, in this particular video, he claims to have a clip that literally destroyed his atheism. And given that atheism is the position of not believing in the existence of a god or gods, the title of his video would imply that the clip he's about to show us either presents the evidence that a god does in fact exist, or somehow shows the logical contradiction entailed by not believing in a god or gods.
Really? That I'd like to see.
Let's dive in.
There is one fact that has completely changed my life.
So one fact that completely changed your life, huh?
And just one thing, not like two or three.
Is this like how the fact of the laws of physics changed your life by convincing you to look both ways before you cross the street? Or how the fact of germ theory changed your life by finally giving you the justification you needed to wash your hands after wiping your ass? Given just how many facts there are that directly impact our behaviors and as such change our lives on a daily basis, please tell us what this one fact, this one thing that's been demonstrated to be true is.
I went from being an atheist for the last 15 years of my life.
I really can't tell you just how many times I hear from theists that they used to be atheists. And they usually pull that line out of their bag for one of two reasons. They either don't understand what atheism actually is and what it entails, or they're just straight up lying to their audience. But going out on a limb here, assuming that you are educated about this and so you're not lying, I'm very curious to hear what exactly was the evidence that was presented to you that confirmed the existence of a god and therefore rationally justified your belief in it.
Absolutely miserable. Just not having a purpose, not believing in meaning, believing we are no different than a mosquito, no more special than cow dung. I mean, that is what atheists will tell you. They will tell you that you are no different than dog poop.
Okay, there's so much to break down here. First and foremost is the appeal to emotion fallacy. Specifically, within that category, your appeal to consequences, which I think confirms, at least at a minimum, that you don't actually understand what atheism is.
What a surprise.
Because if you did, you'd know that your inability to find an emotional utility in holding a particular position does not logically entail that that position is false. Just as the ability to find emotional utility in holding a position does not entail that position is true. We also know this because there are hundreds of millions of people worldwide, such as myself, that claim the exact opposite. That our lives, both psychologically and emotionally, dramatically improved once we shed ourselves of the chains of indoctrination. But that fact is not evidence that any god or god doesn't exist. Were we non-believers to try and make that argument, we would be committing the same fallacy that you just did. Second up is the non sequitur. Now, while I'm pretty sure that you claiming that all atheists are basically telling people that human life is equivalent in value to dog shit is just you being hyperbolic, even if an atheist were to actually make that claim, that would not be an indictment of atheism itself. And that's because when you make claims like this, it's not actually atheism that you're talking about. What you're actually talking about is an aspect of philosophical nihilism, that nothing in the universe has any inherent value. What you either are deliberately ignoring or you simply don't know is that the position of atheism does not logically entail holding to philosophical nihilism. And that while a great many people may emotionally recoil from that particular philosophical concept, that doesn't entail that any god or gods do in fact exist. The justification justification for the 2 points have nothing to do with one another. And lastly, given the context that you've established here is the false dichotomy. You expressed that as an atheist you felt miserable, and that the reason you felt miserable is because you felt that atheism logically entailed you to be a philosophical nihilist. The issue here now is that because you are claiming to be a theist, your prior statement implies that you made that change because with it you can now discern the mind-independently true or objective values of everything in the universe. This is basically you stating that there are only 2 logical options, moral nihilism or moral realism. Now, ignoring the fact that appealing to a mind that definitionally references nothing external of itself to assign values to anything, as simultaneously being the source of mind-independent valuations would be a logical contradiction, you've completely overlooked the position of moral relativism, that moral valuations are subjectively determined by the individual and relativistically assigned, meaning that the values themselves are dependent upon their relationship to an external referent. I'm just going to be honest with you, Exposing. We're not even 21 seconds into your video in which you claim to have a clip that you will later reference that completely destroys atheism, and you've already established your contextual foundation by committing 4 logical fallacies.
Not a great start.
Humans are not special.
I actually agree with this. In the context of the universe itself, it is pure hubris to believe that human beings are in any way special. But don't get me wrong, that doesn't translate to human life, or any life for that matter, having 0 value in any possible context. For example, while I can't speak for everyone, I personally hold that because of the unique roles that every species on this planet plays in the balancing of the biosphere that we are dependent upon for our survival, and that the elimination of any one of those roles can have dire consequences on all the other species, all life on the planet has equal value in the context of our continued survival.
This is the biggest lie that's ever been told.
I really wish the vast majority of you theist content creators would learn how to communicate an idea without sounding like you got a score of 10 on the verbal portion of your SAT. The term lie refers to the act of making a false statement with the intent to deceive. But if a person makes a false statement unaware that what they're saying is false, that by definition is not lying. That's referred to as being mistaken or uninformed. By using that term here, Exposing, you are implying that the position of moral nihilism is a known falsehood, and that the people who hold to that position and argue for it are intentionally deceiving others. And here's where either your lack of philosophical understanding or your deliberate lie have trapped you. Nihilism at its core is a metaphysical position. Essentially, it's a position of pure philosophical abstraction, and just like any other metaphysical position, the truth of it is not something that can actually be ascertained, which, by the way, is the biggest problem in the field of metaphysics. Oftentimes, the metaphysical position you wind up holding is the one that just validates your subjective feelings about the world. What this means is that even if moral nihilism were actually false, we currently have no way of determining that without first begging the question, which entails that while it's logically possible that the proponents for moral nihilism could be mistaken, currently, due to the fact that it cannot be logically determined either way, they can't possibly be lying. But putting aside your lack of philosophical understanding, the worst part about this is your assertion that moral nihilism is a lie implies that you are able to do 2 things. One, that you are able to demonstrate that a God actually exists in external reality without begging the question, and 2, that you are able to reconcile the mind-independent contradiction that is logically entailed by the specific God that you believe in.
If you are an atheist, watch this clip and it will heal you. It will cure your atheism.
The desperation of your hyperbole is both obvious and pathetic. The only thing that would eliminate me from being an atheist is a theist providing evidence that a God actually exists in external reality.
You're not God.
Yes, I am, Jesus!
The question is that what the clip that you're about to show people is doing?
Atheism turns out to be nothing more than intellectual laziness. I promise you that probably most of you who are atheists didn't study philosophy or mathematics or science.
Lucky for you, I did, though you may not come to see it that way.
You just maybe took a little puff of something and realized, this world is really big. And all my friends are very different from me and they all have their own religions. How can my religion be true and they all be wrong? Surely all of this is a myth. Everything we've been told is a lie. Religion is a lie. God is a lie. Oh my God.
How about, and I'm just spitballing here, you stop doing everything you can to try and poison the well and actually get to this clip that you think solves everything?
Slow down, relax, and use your mind. Watch this clip and let it lead you away from atheism once and for all.
Wait, what?
So what you posed there is somewhat contradictory. You first expressed that the person who is watching this should use their mind.
Use your mind.
Which I understand to mean that we should be ready to take the lead on formulating a conclusion by rationally evaluating what is being said in the clip. And what I mean by rational evaluation is the application of logic and what we know to be true and the eschewment of emotion. But then you say we should let it lead us away from atheism.
And let it lead you away from atheism.
Which implies not only that being an atheist is an active choice someone makes, which it is not, but also that those who are watching the clip should allow what's being expressed there to lead them towards its theistic conclusion, which of course would entail a degree of suspension of one's critical faculties in the conclusion drawing process. Ultimately, you want people to think, but only in the way that you want them to think. Now, personally exposing because of the way you articulated this, I'm inclined to interpret it as you mistakenly saying the quiet parts out loud, and that the efficacy of what's about to be said in the clip you're about to show us hinges entirely upon the audience's willingness to commit themselves to an emotional appeal.
Attain belief in a God because it will improve your life.
That's also not logically entailed.
And if you have kids, do not give them atheism.
While I personally understand that you don't want parents to teach their kids that no God or gods exist, your feelings are completely irrelevant on this front. I would simply advocate for parents to teach their kids about intellectual honesty and how of the two worldviews, theistic or non-theistic, only one of them is begging the question at its core.
For God's sake, keep your kids away from atheism. Give them something to believe in.
There are many things, more productive things to believe in, other than fictional characters invented by ancient people to explain phenomena that they didn't understand and make them feel special in what they perceived was an uncaring universe.
Have you seen atheists?
You really about to go down this route?
They look withered and dry and thirst. They don't look well.
Well, as stupid of an appeal as that was, at least it's visually different from the fedora atheist.
Whereas you look at religious folks, they look healthy. They have a spirit about them.
Tell us you've never been through the Bible Belt without telling us.
The journey to attain a personal God in your life must be made at all costs. There's nothing more important than attaining this God.
You know, you'd think that if it was that important, this God, in all of its infinite power and wisdom, would both know and be able to provide me with exactly what I need to be convinced that it exists. And yet, it still hasn't done that. And you can't appeal to free will here, exposing, because we know from studying your book that the Damascus Road experience that occurs in Acts 9:1-9, that your God can actually do this without violating someone's free will. From this internal critique, we can see that it is logically possible for this entity to do this, and yet it still doesn't do it. So either this entity exists and it simply doesn't want to do that for me, which of course would logically violate its loving nature and its desire to have a personal relationship with me by putting the onus of my atheism on itself, or it's not doing it because it doesn't exist to do it, which of course is the most parsimonious and therefore rational conclusion.
And I'm here to tell you, you can rationally attain a personal God using logic, using evidence, by just opening your mind and unlearning all the junk you've learned. It is all nonsense.
Do you hear yourself when you talk?
So let me get this straight. The evidence for the existence of your God lies in the application of reason and logic, which would of course entail the use of a critically evaluative methodology absent emotion. But in order to find that evidence, I first have to abandon the logic and reason that was critically applied in order to establish the knowledge set that I have now, which of course would leave me with nothing but my emotions to use as an evaluative tool.
This is such a beautiful specimen, full of contradictions.
And here's the proof. Watch this clip.
At last, we can finally ignore all of your fallacious nonsense, and we can get to this purported evidence of your God.
I have lots of fun with my scientific friends. I sometimes ask them, what do you do science with? And of course, they name some expensive machine. I say, no. Oh, they say, you mean and they're about to say mind when they realize that's not politically correct. And they say your brain. I said, okay, I believe the brain and the mind are separate, but what is your brain?
Okay, so I think some context is necessary here. For those who may not recognize him, that guy who sounds like he's about to set up a false equivalence is Irish mathematician John Lennox. And this clip that exposes playing comes from a small roundtable discussion held in 2023 that involved three prominent apologists: Lennox, biochemist Michael Behe, and author Stephen Meyer. all of whom are staunch proponents of the pseudoscientific concept of intelligent design, and are frequently cited by groups such as the Institute for Creation Research and Answers in Genesis. Now, this particular roundtable discussion, which was titled By Design, is part of the Hoover Institution's Uncommon Knowledge series, and it was hosted by the Hoover Institution fellow Peter Robinson. Founded by Herbert Hoover in 1919, a decade before his presidency, the Hoover Institution started out as a Stanford-adjacent archive for collected materials related to World War I, but over time it evolved into a heavy conservative-leaning public policy think tank that promotes ideas like personal and economic liberty, free enterprise, and limited government. Now here, during this roundtable, Lennox, Behe, and Meyer each take turns expounding upon what they think is the evidence for the existence of a creator. That all being said, let's hear the rest of Lennox's supposed gotcha that he proposes to his unspecified scientific friends.
Give me the brief history of the brain. I ask them, and I've done this many times. It's fascinating. And they say, well, the brain in the end is the end product of a mindless, unguided process.
So what's the problem?
I see no issue here. As far as the evidence goes, and without multiplying our entities unnecessarily, something by the way that Lennox just offhandedly admitted that he does by acknowledging that he's a dualist, the mechanism by which we interface with what we perceive to be external reality is the brain, or more precisely, the entire nervous system, both central and peripheral. We understand from the evidence and the predictive modeling that the human nervous system is the result of millions of years of evolution, and that there is no evidence that indicates or even implies that an external creating agent even exists, let alone designed it. It's precisely the rational, evidence-backed answer that we should expect from people, especially those engaged in scientific endeavors.
And I smile at them and I say, and you trust it?
Yes, and that's because we don't really have a choice in the matter. Ultimately, every single conclusion you make regarding anything concerning external reality is going to come down to the level of confidence that you have in the set total of your sensory experiences. Even if you do believe that a God does in fact exist, the only indicator that you can point to is how you interpret your subjective internal experience. The really important thing is where you opt to reason from there. Are you blithely satisfied simply appealing to mental concepts that make you personally feel good without methodologically demonstrating if they do in fact represent anything in actual reality? Or do you rationally recognize that your personal intuitions and feelings are just the starting point and that without that methodology you don't really have a system for establishing truth? Which are you more interested in? What is actually true or just what you want to be true? And are you intellectually honest enough to challenge it?
Did you hear that?
Oh, you again.
Yes, we all heard Lennox pose a question about the human brain that appeared to be setting up a false equivalence. In other words, he didn't actually say anything of import.
If you didn't catch that, rewind and rewatch that, because that is the most important thing you will ever hear. If the process of evolution is based on a random, unguided, unintelligent process.
But that wasn't really what Lennox was articulating, was it? This is what Lennox actually said.
And they say, well, the brain in the end is the end product of a mindless, unguided process.
And this is what you said.
If the process of evolution is based on a random, unguided, unintelligent process.
You added the part about being random and you falsely equated mindless with unintelligent. And it's really important to understand why Lennox himself didn't use those terms. It's pretty much held in the field of evolutionary biology that evolutionary outcomes, while unguided by some external mind, are not random and not completely unintelligent. While you can argue that some of the selection pressures that act on a population can occur at random, like say a natural disaster that leads to a sudden climate shift, and even that sexual selection pressures do have some random variables in play, given how many organisms make a choice of who to mate with based upon what they are aware of, the ultimate outcomes of these pressures, which are expressed in the surviving generations, are not randomized. The generations that survive to pass their genes on to the next are the determined outcomes. Lennox didn't use those terms because he knows that to do so would be intellectually dishonest, and whether or not you are actively aware of it exposing, processing, you did choose to use those intellectually dishonest terms in order to try and push your own narrative.
And that process has led to this creation of a mind?
No, as Lennox said, it led to the development of the brain. Lennox didn't say anything about the mind itself, because he's aware that people who don't hold to his dualist position conclude from the available evidence that the phenomenon of mind or consciousness is an emergent property of a functioning brain. That's why he vocally made the point of not diving into the whole mind portion.
And then this mind goes on to tell you that the process which created it was unintelligent.
That actually makes sense. If an unguided system results in a brain that can perceive and analyze the system through processing sensory information, and that brain is the only way by which we can reason about, rationalize, and determine what is most likely to be true about the system being perceived, reasoning, by the way, that is at least sufficient enough to have kept our species alive and outcompeting every other now extinct member of our genus for the past 300,000 years, it stands to reason that we can trust our nervous systems to get us at least partially to what is truth. So, in a way, evolution does positively select for truth tracking.
Yes, science!
Why would you believe anything this mind has to say?
Because it's the only interface we have with what we perceive to be external reality that we can also demonstrate exists. There literally is no demonstrable way to do this unless you're willing to beg the question.
Why would you believe the results of its computation?
Because the predictive models we develop based upon the evidence-backed explanatory models work and yield to us new information. If our senses were entirely faulty, then our interpretations of the evidence would also be faulty, which of course would render any independent predictions that we make about reality equally faulty. But when those predictions are independently confirmed to be true, they validate the models that they were predicated on, which in turn validates the interpretations of the evidence that were used to develop those models. This is literally a scientific basic that you should have learned back in middle school.
If evolution is a random, dumb process, then your mind is also dumb.
And that's just a complete non sequitur born out of your scientific illiteracy and personal incredulity.
And you cannot trust anything it says, so when it tells you that everything is random, you can't trust it. When it tells you there is no God, you can't trust it.
And that's just it. It doesn't tell us that it's random, and it doesn't tell us for a fact that there is no God or gods. What it does tell us is that evolutionary outcomes are determined by a combined variety of random and non-random selection pressures, and that there is no rational justification to believe in the existence of a God or gods until such evidence can be presented that would warrant that belief. I'm starting to think, Exposing, that maybe you're not the one who should be interpreting this clip for people. Because while you do have the right level of pretentiousness, your scientific understanding is just straight Dunning-Kruger.
Maybe when it tells you there is God, you can't trust it.
That would be the first legitimately honest thing you've said.
We'll get there, and we could prove that there is a God. And not only is there a God, but there's a personal God, a God that interferes in day-to-day human affairs. Let's keep watching.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing what evidence you have that such an entity exists.
I say, now tell me honestly, that computer you use every day, if you knew that it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it?
Yep, Lennox is drawing a false analogy here between the human brain and a tool that is created by humans to process information faster and more efficiently. Essentially, this is a semantic variation of the watchmaker argument.
Now, here's the thing. I have spoken with dozens of leading scientists and pushed them on this, and every single one has said no.
Of course they'd say no, John. That's not exactly the shocker you think it is. A computer is by definition a tool for calculation created by humans. But if we're talking about something that was not created by humans and you are just arbitrarily labeling it as a computer, then based solely upon your assertion, we would have no way of determining if what we're talking about is actually a computer. We would first have to have access to this thing, and then we would have to hit it with every single test that we can conceive of to determine if it can do what a computer can do before we can label it a computer. But you left all of that important stuff out of your thought experiment, John, and I surmise you did so deliberately, because the part you left out happens to be the part that is concerned with the evidence that supports a conclusion. It's the part that keeps us from reasoning fallaciously, like begging the question, false equivalences, and arguments from incredulity and ignorance, like you are ultimately doing with your assertion of a creator.
I said, you have a problem.
No, the problem rests squarely with you. And could you possibly be more pretentious, you smug prick?
Because you are giving me an argument that undermines rationality.
No, they aren't, because they have a methodology that leads to novel testable predictions. And as you yourself, John, are an Oxford-educated mathematician, it is impossible for you to not know this. But hey, it's not like Behe or Meyer would ever give you any pushback, and it's obvious Robinson is far too busy maintaining the momentum of the Dutch rudders to do so.
And they turn to me and they say, where did you get that argument?
Yeah, I would ask that too, because your conclusion does not logically follow.
I said, well, firstly from Charles Darwin. They say, I don't believe you.
I wouldn't believe you either, mostly because what you're doing is pointing at 150-year-old science to make your point that has long since been corrected and improved upon.
And then I quote Darwin. Darwin's doubt.
This
not
was his
the one,
other doubt.
That's his other doubt.
Yep.
Darwin's doubt about the reliability of human rationality.
Yep.
Okay, so there's quite a bit of context that's missing here. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species was published in 1859. That publication sparked intense debate and controversy within and outside of the scientific community. Now, what Lennox is referring to here is what is called Darwin's horrid doubt, and it was something that Darwin expressed in a letter that he wrote to philosopher and mathematician William Graham, a letter he wrote in response to Graham's book The Creed of Science, published in 1881. Which was Graham's philosophical and epistemological investigation of the accuracy and ethics of science. The problem was, despite all of its minor insights into basic beliefs, Graham just wound up criticizing scientific methodology for doing exactly what it's structured to do: use evidence to generate predictive models to determine accurate mechanistic explanations for observed phenomena. Which means to say that scientific methodology is not doing the job of straight philosophy, which you can tell from reading the book was apparently something that Graham took great umbrage with. To quote Darwin directly from his letter, "But then with me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy." So in Darwin's mind, given his very early understanding of evolution and common descent, and the fact that the structure of DNA and a better understanding of genetics wouldn't be discovered for almost another century, he was having difficulty reconciling how an apparently intelligent organism such as human beings could arise naturally from a system with no intelligence behind it. But it should also be of note that despite his doubt, Darwin never committed an argument from personal incredulity by claiming that such an event was logically impossible. But like all creationists do, Lennox here chooses to cherry-pick the words of a guy who was born over 200 years ago, whose work, now almost 170 years old, has been wildly improved upon in the modern age, who himself was the furthest thing from a philosopher, and who, being raised a believer, found himself an agnostic in his later years as he struggled with his prior beliefs in light of his discoveries. In short, these three pretentious douche nozzles giggling in tandem that Darwin had a doubt, is not the paradigm-shattering issue that Lennox is presenting it to be. Darwin's ideas were revolutionary at the time, and being an intellectually honest scientist, he of course would acknowledge and express concern about the things that he himself was unable to reconcile. But his apparent inability to reconcile the emergence of human consciousness was not him doubting evolution itself. It was him acknowledging that there were gaps in his understanding, such as with the Cambrian explosion and the fossil record, which actually makes sense because Darwin held to gradualism and thus had no concept of punctuated equilibrium, which wouldn't be a thing until 1972, and abiogenesis, which also tracks because Darwin himself was not an organic chemist, and the real work in that field wouldn't kick off until 1953 with the Miller-Urey experiment. So once again, all we're really seeing here at this roundtable is the common apologist tactic of framing intellectual honesty in science as being a defeater.
Now this, to my mind, goes to the heart of the implication of the whole business. And it's why I believe that there is an intelligence behind the universe.
Because, despite all the evidence, you can't reconcile how an intelligent species could arise from an unguided process, which is really just an argument from personal incredulity.
I'm a mathematician. All mathematicians and scientists are people of faith, not necessarily in God, but they believe in the rational intelligibility of the universe.
And that I'm just going to call out as a straight up lie, because I have no doubt that John here is more than aware that faith and confidence are not the same thing. It's this kind of intellectual dishonesty that makes intelligent design proponents unbearable to speak with, because they're just infinitely more interested in trying to drag everyone else down to their level of unjustifiability.
And
now,
the reliability of the mind.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And therefore, what do they base that on?
Again, predictive modeling.
If you base that on a mindless, unguided evolutionary process, you're destroying rationality.
Which is why the methodology does not operate with that as a presupposition. The methodology looks at what we have access to, doesn't make any unnecessary assumptions about reality, and then addresses the likelihood of any given proposition being true by critically examining the evidence. Lennox here is basically ignoring the most important parts of the methodology, just so he can make the accusation that scientists who do not conclude what he has concluded are just doing the exact same thing that he's doing, having faith in the existence of something that cannot be demonstrated to be the case, which of course anyone with even an ounce of intellectual honesty within them knows they are not.
C.S. Lewis saw that in the 1940s. He said any theory that undermines rationality cannot be true because you're using your rationality to get to it.
And Lewis was also criticized for deliberately leaving out the important recursive aspects of the methodology in order to misrepresent scientific endeavor. If there was any merit at all to what Lewis was saying, he would have been able to provide a predictive model that utilized the God concept to make stronger and more accurate predictions about reality than any others that we have established. But he couldn't do that, just like you, Behe, Meyer, and any other creationists out there can't. All each of you can do is ultimately point at your goofy book that you special plead for and beg the question. And had you not been having this little circle jerk of yours in a safe space, you would have been swiftly rebutted on this. And from here, we're going to go ahead and skip the rest of Lennox's bullshit, because he just goes on to cite the personal views of other philosophers, specifically Alvin Plantinga and Thomas Nagel, while doubling down on his argument from personal incredulity. What's important though is that at no point does he ever present any evidence of this creating entity that he speaks of, nor does he ever state that the emergence of intelligence as an attribute in an unguided system is a logical impossibility.
Oh, I guess he forgot.
So if you believe in evolution, random evolution through random mutations,
well, while that's not really a completely accurate representation of evolution, though I'm not really surprised given that you haven't represented anything accurately here, and that includes the very guy that you were using for a citation, that's what the mountains of evidence shows us, and it's what's confirmed by the predictive models.
an unguided process, if you believe in that, then you cannot believe in rationality.
Yeah, that's just your bullshit argument from personal incredulity. However, I will also say that even if what you were saying was true, if we could determine that it was logically impossible for intelligent agents to arise from a system of unguided natural forces, that still wouldn't be evidence for the existence of your specific God. That would still be an entirely separate claim.
And therefore you cannot believe your math or your science.
We can because, as I explained before, predictive modeling covers the bases here.
You cannot do science with an unintelligent, irrational mind.
Oh, you were tied to the tracks and that stupid train just kept running over you now, didn't it? Running over you.
Yeah, so now you're saying that unguided evolution can only give rise to irrational minds, which makes me think that you don't really know what rational means. The term rational refers to being in accordance with reason or logic. Reason here referring simply to understanding and forming judgments by a process of logic. Logic here referring to the language that we utilize to describe the operations of reality from our specific frame of reference. Which means that if unguided evolution could only ever give rise to irrational minds, then every single member of the human genus would have been fundamentally unable to navigate their own environments, let alone communicate information about those environments to others in a coherent way, which no doubt would have led to the swift extinction of our species. This is why Lennox specifically did not make the mistake that you're making by boxing himself in with statements about impossibility, because then he would have to back up that statement by showing the logical contradiction, and he knows that that's something that neither he nor the two grifters bookending him can do. And we're going to go ahead and skip this last section for two reasons. One, exposing atheism just goes on to double down on every single logical fallacy he committed previously, and two, he provides exactly zero evidence for the existence of his God. He doesn't even provide a deductive argumentation for his God. All he does is sit there and whinge about how much he doesn't like what he erroneously thinks is logically entailed by acknowledging Darwinian evolution, which, by the way, is not even the model currently used in evolutionary biology. If you're going to make a positive claim, EA, like you did regarding the existence of your God back at the beginning of this video, it helps if you actually bring along some evidence to back it up, because the rabid combination of your scientific ignorance, your fifis, and your intellectual dishonesty are just not going to cut it anymore. Now, as I've explained before, maintaining intellectual honesty is a vital part of bridging the divide. And one of the best ways to do this is to actually engage with the people that you disagree with, instead of operating from a set of unfounded assumptions that were likely gleaned from a bunch of talking heads that you happen to agree with. It will be through a consistent setting of the example that we can eventually raise the bar for these kinds of conversations, and perhaps even one day establish some real progress towards the issues that concern both believer and non-believer alike. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. A link to where you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you like what you saw here and would like to support this channel further, a link to channel memberships and to get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear is also in the description. Once again, a massive thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together we can bridge the divide.